Good. Thank you, Steve. Thank you for joining us from the West Coast, Los Angeles.
Sure.
Hours behind us. Is it early morning there still? I'm not sure, but anyway, it's a pleasure to sort of really kickstart the campaign, I think, for this wonderful novel, Here Goes Nothing. It's a wildly original, wildly funny, wildly macabre, and wildly heartbreaking novel narrated by a dead man. He's a very angry dead man for two reasons. He's been murdered, and he's pissed off about that. He's also a fairly militant atheist who's had a sneering contempt for the supernatural in his life. So he's really pissed off to have been proven wrong about that too. So Steve, why don't you take it from here? Tell us about Angus, your hero or anti-hero. How the hell has he got to where he's at? I'd love to hear about that.
Yeah, it's hard to say what the beginning of the novel, like where I came up with this idea from.
Yeah.
I have a couple of strange beginnings for it, which was that well, there's two really. So I think in like 20 years ago, I went to the movie Magnolia. And when I came out, which is a story about characters jumping from one character to another. And when I came out, I thought, oh, wouldn't it be funny to have a story in which you jump from one character to another, except they're on different planes of existence. And then cut to about 20 years after that, I had finished my second novel. And my novels are kind of about fear. And so I had in my mind wanting to write a fear trilogy. So my first novel was about the fear of death. The second novel is about the fear of life, being like suffering, fear of suffering. And then the third novel, I wanted to write about this other fear, which is, I think, the fear that drives a lot of human behavior, which is the fear of the opinions of other people. And as I was thinking about how to address that fear, I was thinking how, we know, and for centuries, for thousands of years, people have been trying to get over this fear by, like bringing corpses to the feast to remind us that we're mortal, and then realizing that after all these years, it still doesn't make any difference to us. We're still frustrated by this thing. And so I thought, well, if mortality won't do it, what about immortality? And then as I started to think about that, I remembered my old idea from 20 years before. And so, yeah, so that's how I sort of started the story. And Angus, the character I've used, he's a kind of I wanted to write a kind of very ordinary guy, very incurious person who doesn't really understand this world. And he is also, as you said, like a militant atheist. He's always been surrounded by people who are kind of in love with themselves for their beliefs. And he's always been very suspicious of that. Meets a woman that he marries and loves. And then a stranger comes to the door one day, and that leads into a very bad direction for him.
Yes, indeed. Let's just go back a little bit, because one of the, this is a novel about three very, very unusual. I mean, Angus is your everyman in many ways, but he's a guy who's been orphaned 4 times. He's a guy who's been a drug pusher and a pickpocket, amongst many other things. Currently, he worked for DHL, and he's also I think this is how I feel about him. I think he suffers a slight imposter syndrome or something. Like when he meets Gracie, we've got to talk a little bit about Gracie, because Gracie is like, just an absolute, I don't know, firecracker of a character or something. She's absolutely amazing. She's something I've never heard of. She's a wedding celebrant. I've heard of wedding celebrants, but she's a wedding celebrant with a difference. And maybe you can tell us about what makes her wedding celebration so different.
So she writes the sermons herself. And I don't know how you describe the sermons, but they're kind of a little cynical, bitter, and they kind of get to the psychological truth behind love and marriage, and the fears and the realities. She's certainly not pulling any punches. She gives the kind of wedding sermons that the sort of parents of the bride and groom want to rush the stage and throw her off, but it's the kind of love it or hate it kind of thing. It's interesting because when I was in my 20s, late 20s, I guess, and my friends started to get married, I made one kind of best man speech at a wedding, and I'm a writer, so I was pretty good at it, and people laughed. And then somebody at that wedding asked me to make a speech at their wedding, to MC their wedding, and so I did. And then I started, like, it just got ridiculous. Like, people were asking me to speak at weddings, and so, and even like acquaintances that I knew. So after a while, I did, because in my 20s and early 30s, I was floundering in terms of career, and so I did actually investigate becoming a celebrant and looked up doing the courses, and so I never ended up doing it, but it was kind of fun to write the sermons that I would have perhaps written.
Yeah, I mean, she has a very sardonic approach to the people she's marrying. It's almost as if, like, part of the thrill is that she's sort of insulting them, but she's very, very funny. And
yeah, kind of it's like a roast at your wedding.
Yeah. I also there's a wonderful way, obviously Angus falls head over heels in love with her. That's the key thing. He's just like mesmerized from the beginning. There's a wonderful like short description you have of her, which I think really conveys her. You describe her as someone who has been involved in 3 road rage incidents, of which 2 of which she was the aggressor. I mean, I think that just really sort of captures the spark of her personality. I would also say she's also a sort of very online character, or too online. I don't know. There's that definition, there's that description of people. She does live her life very, I think probably Angus really hates it, I imagine, like someone who's so expressive about their life and is willing to sort of express it to strangers online. He seems, that's an interesting sort of tension, one of the many tensions between the two of them, I think. But she's just very like performative.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, we either all know somebody who is like that, or we are a little bit like that ourselves. I think there is a tension with, I mean, I almost don't know anybody who doesn't have that tension in their lives of being too online, or knowing people who do, and kind of love hating ourselves for it. And I think it's almost impossible to write nowadays without engaging in that kind of thing.
Yeah. So we have Angus and we have Gracie. They get married, blissfully happy it seems, but they're trying to have a kid. And then there's a knock on their door, or her door. Gracie's at home alone. Mooney's been away for a couple of days. There's a knock at the door, and she opens the door, and it's a guy called Owen Fogel. Who is Owen Fogel, and why is he knocking at her door?
Well, Owen used to live in the house, ostensibly, as a child. That's where he grew up. And Owen is dying. He's a dying man who wanted to come to the house that he grew up in. He says to just come in and remember his mother and father, and so Gracie decides to grudgingly let him into the house, and as it turns out, he never really leaves.
Which I think is brilliant. It's like one of the great insinuations into someone else's living. The way that he just manages to sort of like slowly but surely insinuate himself into that house and never leave is just like brilliant. It's so well done. And he's such a scoundrel. He's like a great scoundrel. He's just really, really, I mean, he's clever. He's almost like Gracie meets her match in some ways. like linguistically, verbally with him or something. Like the sort of, I mean, the conversation, the dialogue between Angus and Gracie is fantastic, but also the dialogue, there's a different kind of dialogue between Gracie and Fogel. It's like, you know, it's just, I don't know, it's competitive, it's dark, it's there's all these things going on, but it's really, really engaging and just really, you know, quite twisted or too or whatever. But anyway, it's just, you know, it's a great, here's the thing, you know, we don't want to spoil too much, but you know, things obviously change when Owen moves into the house, and soon after, Angus finds himself in the afterlife, which is, we invite readers to discover, you know, how that happens and how he got there and why Angus is sort of fueled by the spirit of revenge and what have you. But there's there's a lot of great dialogue. There's a lot of great, things about this novel. But there's also like, it's the fun thing about this novel is it really sort of engages with big themes in a very, very just energetic, lively, and funny way. You know, you've got life, death, revenge, apocalypse. But I was also thinking of love. This is only something recently. I was just flicking through the novel earlier today, and I I've forgotten the quote, but you have the quote from Cesare Pavese, the great Italian novelist of the mid-century Italy. He says, love is the cheapest religion. Love is the cheapest religion, or something of that kind. Could you discuss that? Because I'm thinking now that love is one of those Mooney is very, very opposed to atheism, very opposed to religions, the supernatural. There's something about love which is sort of like, it's kind of supernatural. It's all those, it consists of things that Angus probably was for a long time cynical about, and then he's hooked. So it's interesting. It's almost like the sort of, the feelings of oceanic depth that people describe, they describe their experience of religion. Also, it's an experience he has when he falls in love with Gracie. And I think, it's an interesting thing to say, he falls hard, falls wildly in love with her. And at the same time, I wonder whether, his anger and disappointment about there being an afterlife is also part of the anger and disappointment of what's come of his relationship with Gracie. I don't know. I'm just curious. It's something it's been sort of percolating in my head this afternoon.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of its kind of love's relationship to religion, I guess you spoke earlier about Gracie's sermons. There's a line that she says at one of the weddings that she is a celebrant at, is something like, love is a miracle only if you don't understand what a miracle is. Meaning that, like, we are kind of pattern-seeking creatures, and we are trying to make connections and fill in the blanks. And we're kind of easily susceptible to, as you said, like, be swept up in that oceanic feeling of, the sort of existential dilemma of aloneness. And love is one of the things that, religion is one of the things that can fill that void for us. And which is why really we shouldn't sneer at religion, because it does fill a deep human need. And in the same way, romantic love definitely does as well.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a lot of conversations about religion and love in this novel is going to generate a lot of conversation about that. But for me, the thing that I'm still happily haunted by your novel is its portrayal of the afterlife. My literary encounter with the afterlife has been, mediated by, Dante, Clive Barker, John Milton. The Inferno is a hellish place. People are just suffering. And then, of course, there are the sort of representations of heaven, which sound blissful and boring and what have you. In your novel, I don't know, it's something different, something I've never even, I don't know, I somehow feel that the afterlife in your novel is sort of like Eastern Europe in the late 1980s. I don't know. It's just the thing that really, really struck me. It's like, it's a genius because, you know, there's civil war in the afterlife. There's enormous polarization in the afterlife. You know, people hate their jobs in the afterlife. It's all, I don't know. I mean, it's just, tell me, please. I really want to know how this representation of the afterlife, which is just, even to this day, and months later, since it's probably 6 months ago since I first read the novel, it's still like, wow.
Yeah, yeah. When you're doing something like that, you're going to create another plane of existence, and you have anything to pick from. Is curious because I could have made it much more fantastical and exciting, but part of the novel, I think I encountered a very similar dilemma with this novel than I did with my last novel, which was my last novel in many ways was a book about exhaustion. And I needed to write a book, in order to do it correctly, I needed to write a book that was exhausting to read.
Right.
And part of like another theme that kind of runs through this book is this idea about the unreliability of subjectivity. And another part of that is this, which sort of goes into like the online stuff we were talking about earlier, is the idea of like one of the greatest attributes of being a human being is we have imagination, and we can imagine anything we like. And it's sort of crazy how unimaginative we are. And when you go online, is a really good example of it. Is the more freedom people have to say whatever they want, the more people sound the same. And so that, in conjunction with the idea of I share some of Angus's sort of skepticism about the afterlife and just the arrogance of human beings, that the idea that once we die, then we'll get all the answers. And I liked the idea of Angus arriving in a place that just poses more questions. The kind of frustration of it. And you're right, like I did have a like a 1980s Soviet, there's one like where as he first arrives and he's walking around, looking around, and there's a guy riding down the street on a bicycle with a refrigerator strapped to his back, which to me is like somehow a classic image from, I don't know, like maybe some film I saw in the 1980s, some documentary footage of some Eastern European place. And I just thought that would be kind of fun to put him in this place that's a little maddening and none of the answers that you would require. I mean, first of all, the idea that in the afterlife you are again mortal, because you die in the afterlife and you don't know where you go from, when you die. Just the fact that question, that the very, the basic question that haunts us, every human being for the last, 200,000 years, is just still the same. There's sort of no greater answer than that. So I just had a lot of fun with that.
No, I think readers are going to be absolutely sort of, shocked, in a sort of remarkable, way about the way that you portray. There's actually, there's, I don't know, there's, one of my favorite passages in the book is, I want to just read it. There's a couple of paragraphs, but it describes, it's page 205. And this is Angus. And I won't do an Australian accent. I'll read in my own accent. My own living situation went from bearable to untenable. The neighbors were hedonistic, unhygienic maniacs. All day and all night long, I could hear arguing, the sound of a person almost but never quite reaching orgasm. The sound of, and a man's voice shouting, "No, I won't lower my voice." My shit-faced neighbors lurked in the dark corridors, held nightly drunken seances to contact the living, sang dueling national anthems in the shower. A reckless aura hung over everything. Doors were left wide open, and people with obscene, radiant faces tried to coax me into eightsomes. Sure, there's a case to be made from moving from languishing on one's deathbed to a sprightly midnight orgy gave one the right to act like a demigod. But I had a bad feeling that a lot of these folks had committed terrible earthly misdeeds that had gone unpunished, and now they could get away with anything. I just love that description of, like, you know, the sort of like living in a sort of, I don't know how you just, it's almost like living in a student dorm or something, a hellish student dorm where everyone else is noisy and everyone's getting up to stuff and you're just, you know, you want to tune out or something. But it's a really, really sort of, you know, vivid portrayal of, you know, of the afterlife. The other thing I wanted to discuss is you started writing this novel in 2018, 2019.
Yeah.
There's a pandemic in the novel. How did you guess it was coming?
I didn't get, you know, it's funny because a lot of writing is problem solving, basically. And so I had the story and I had Angus going over to the afterlife and then going back to the house. But in my, you know, as I started writing it, I didn't really have Gracie and Owen doing anything. They were just kind of getting to know each other in the house. And I'm like, something's got to be going on here as well. And then like literally a phrase came to me, which was apocalypse on earth, revolution in heaven. And I thought, that is what I need to write. And so I thought, you know, of the various things that could befall the earth. And this is early 2019. And I thought, you know, a pandemic will come eventually. And so unfortunately or fortunately for me in the book, like I spent a lot of 2019, you know, reading about pandemics and zoonotic diseases and, you know, all that kind of thing. So when things started happening early 2020, I was well versed.
It's very, and the way that you just, you know, not to give away too much, but obviously the fact that people are dying at much higher levels on Earth really has an impact on the sort of ecology of the afterlife. It starts to become overcrowded and all kinds of interesting things. There's sort of bigger social things are happening in the afterlife, as well as Angus's own, like, he's like a revenge, he's like a hero from a revenge tragedy who's trying to get back and, you know, revenge himself on, you know, on certain people or whatever. But it's like the afterlife becomes, you know, quite overwhelmed. You know, one thing, you know, I've said it, you know, you write marvelous dialogue. You know, anyone who's read your novels will acknowledge that. And also there's a certain like energy to, you know, to your sentences, the way that you write. Now, for the last few years, you've been working in a couple of writers' rooms in Los Angeles as a screenwriter. What, you know, I'm curious about a couple of things. One, you know, how did you get that gig? But the second thing is, what's the difference between, you know, working collaboratively in a writer's room and, you know, writing fiction on your own, researching pandemics and all that kind of stuff? I mean, has being a screenwriter impacted the way you write fiction now?
No, they're very separate jobs. And in fact, the interesting thing about, and I mean, what I learned, because I was excited to get into a writer's room. I'd always kind of wanted to, and I got lucky that the first show that I worked on, the dialogue in the show, which is it's described as kind of Waiting for Godot as a police procedural. It's kind of like these characters sitting around. It's called No Activity, and it has a great comedic cast of Will Ferrell and Bob Odenkirk and Amy Sedaris, and luckily the creator of the show had read my books and thought that the dialogue kind of was fairly similar. So that was my way in. And what I discovered over the course of kind of working for that show for a couple of seasons and then for this other show called Guilty Party is that a writing job for TV is not a writing job. It's a brainstorming job with 10% writing. So most of the time you're just sort of sitting in a room with a bunch of smart, funny people It's kind of like a dinner party, except you're discussing story and character. I mean, the last room I was in went for almost sort of 4 months, and I probably wrote for 2 weeks. The rest of the time, I didn't even pick up a pen. It's basically a brainstorming job, which is really fun.
So actually, it sounds like you're almost two different personalities are involved in writing scripts and writing a novel. It's a very,
Yeah, I mean, I still, with my novels, I still write by hand. And
right.
so I feel like for me, it's like me, and like I have a visceral connection to the written word. I can't compose on a computer or a typewriter. And so it's basically all the writing happens at the level of the pen and whatever's in my brain. And, that kind of thing where I'm not sure whether my hand is moving a little bit faster than my conscious mind is. So I'm surprised by what I'm writing, along with, the reader eventually, which is just a completely different thing. I mean, it's like apples and oranges to like sitting in a room with a bunch of people thinking, hey, wouldn't it be fun if he pulled the gun out here and then we ran over here and then we cut to this other scene. And it's almost like a lot of other writers that I know, they either they're journalists, they do journalism, or they teach. I feel these jobs are as different as that. Like I just don't feel they have anything in common almost.
Wow. Well, that's a really fascinating insight into two modes of writing. I want to just finish with this thought. This is a startlingly original novel. And whenever you read a novel, a reader is reading a novel for the first time, even if it's a novel that you're enjoying tremendously. I feel sometimes a reader is always trying to outguess or outwit the writer. We're trying to guess ahead, and every time you outwitted me every time writing this novel. Every twist and turn I didn't see coming. It's a continually surprising novel. And I think on that note, I want to congratulate you for writing a novel like that just kept me guessing, kept surprising me. And I just thought, so many times, so many WTF moments or whatever. It's just really, really well done. So, we're thrilled to be publishing this book, which we'll be doing in May of next year. And on that note, thank you, Steve, for joining us from LA. And I want to head back to Amelia in the studio.